Hello and welcome to another edition of Another Book Review. This week I'll be reviewing 1999 by Ross Benish. The subtitle is The Year Low Culture Conquered America and Kickstarted Our Bizarre Times. I received this copy from the author in exchange for a free and fair review through ebook, so I don't have a cover to show you this week. Just to give you a quick background on the author before going into the book, Ross has written a few other nonfiction books. One of them is called Rural Rebellion, which is about Nebraska and its shift towards republicanism or conservatism. This book, 1999, is what it says on the tin. It's a kind of examination of the year 1999 through several different prisms, mostly through the cultural artifacts of that year. And he explains how this year was pivotal in terms of certain concepts and ideas that we now see and take for granted today. So things like uh, pro wrestling and kayfabe, the Insane Clown Posse, and the Insane Clown Posse's uh, appeal to a relatively small number of fans who feel that they're ostracized and outcasts, and he kind of proclaims them as the world's most hated band. He looks at kind of the mindless consumerism of Pokemon and Beanie Babies and how that was um, a way for this kind of um, consumerism without end and kind of the stratification of all of these different hierarchies of wealth or accumulation. He looks at the adult film industry and how that broke. He looks at the video game industry, where that was, and how the assault on video games have changed over time in terms of them being a boogeyman. This was the year of Columbine and their position down in that scapegoating. So if I sound a little rambly, it's a relatively long book. In terms of different topics, it has, I don't know, roughly 7 or 8 chapters as it goes through these different things. And I think he does a relatively good job of staying on topic and exploring these concepts through these things and applying them to today's world. I was 15 in 1999, so a lot of it was not necessarily new information. It was things I had known about before, and some of it I had to pause and think about, how much of these things that I hadn't maybe thought about in a while apply to today. Even then, I learned some stuff. I didn't realize that Pokemon was as huge. I guess I'd never thought to consider like how large a product that was in terms of the ability to kick off money. But at one point, he basically says it's the most lucrative entertainment product that's ever existed. It's kind of the Pokemon franchise, which was huge then, and it makes sense if you stop and think uh, about just how much money continues to kick off years later. I think Pokemon Go is 2015, 2016. And so this is like 15, 16 years after the franchise began in America, or the first movie came out in America, and continues to be this thing. I hadn't really considered. He does spend some time talking about Jerry Springer and the Jerry Springer Show and just how huge of a cultural thing that was at the time. And I think that's been a little bit lost, of just how pervasive that show and just how different it was um, in terms of the amount of accepting of kind of this just like the worst instincts in people. He talks a little bit about Geraldo Rivera being an antecedent of that. And there are times where when you're setting your book up this way, where it's just one year and you're looking at everything through the prism of one year, and the thesis is this year kind of explains everything. There are times where you have to kind of fudge on that a little bit, and I think he's pretty clear-eyed about that. He does talk a little bit about Geraldo Rivera, and Geraldo Rivera being something of an antecedent or precursor to the Jerry Springer Show, and how the Jerry Springer Show now is kind of bled into this concept of just the worst in people and just kind of these constant scandals that we see with politicians, especially. But we've just kind of accepted this idea of not necessarily holding people accountable or people being able to go on these shows, show us the worst of themselves, and still be able to make a living with that kind of truth. So I, I found it mostly the parts of it that I liked. I like does go over some of the business stuff and some of the politics and how the politics of this era changed things. He talks about I'm going to get the name of the bill wrong because I always do, but there's a bill that came to pass either 1999 or 2000 that allowed for the accumulation of several radio stations in television stations. The deregulation of the entertainment industry allowed for networks to produce shows that also ran on their own networks where they hadn't been able to do that before. He also talks about kind of the consolidation of the industry with Viacom purchasing CBS. I'm not sure if CBS purchased Viacom or the other way around, but basically bringing all these kind of networks together. So you have CBS, MTV, VH1, Comedy Central, etc., all owned on the same network, which was something that led to reality television exploding and how that was very different than what had come before it. Kind of talks about the youth culture of 1999. If there's one area I wish he maybe had talked a little bit more about, and I think it would have had to kind of go, it would have broken the way that he has the book formatted, but he doesn't really spend a ton of time talking about how the youth culture of today was very different than the youth culture of 1999 in terms of the racial demographics. It's very, very different. And who was being targeted, I think it was much more male centered. He talks a little bit about that, but doesn't spend a ton of time talking about how it was like a pretty large youth population. A lot of that was very male, white centered, and he doesn't talk about really the change, how that has changed or not changed since then. He maybe could have spent a little bit more time there. He talks a little bit about the Beanie Babies. So the Beanie Baby speculation, how that was kind of a lower class version of what was happening on the stock market, where you have the 1990s are just kind of a spectacular run of a growth in consumerism and a growth in the stock market. A lot of that is driven by debt and debt instruments. But he talks about how there's a spirit of speculation where people are being told, there cites stories of people working at McDonald's and Happy Meals being stolen in order to this belief that these Beanie Babies are going to keep rising in prices forever. So it's kind of this exuberant speculation, irrational exuberance that we see, a few years later with the stock market crash. Also, we see in 1999 with the Beanie Babies. So overall, it was fun. It was like kind of a walk down memory lane. I think I learned some things. A lot of it was stuff I knew already, and a lot of it was trying to apply and see how these things culturally had shifted, and the importance of this year in that cultural shift. I thought was interesting. A lot of it was, like I said, most stuff that I knew. I didn't realize how involved the telecos were in the growth of the adult film industry and how they made some money, basically made a lot of money off of those early web services where credit card information was being sent over the web, and how they profited from that without really ever owning up to profiting from it. I thought was interesting that I hadn't thought about before. And then if you're someone who's a video gamer, I think the one thing, most of the chapters are this thing was happening in 1999, and that directly led into the culture of today. Video games are the one area that basically he says the culture has kind of flipped on video games. And I think he really does a good, interesting job of explaining kind of the culture of scapegoats, things being blamed for violent actions, going back to jazz music, rock and roll music, comic books, and how video games were just kind of the next one of those things, and how they don't take as much flack as they used to. I don't know if that's the only reason they don't take as much flack is because they become ultra popular. I don't know if it's just a matter of the moral messengers of before. I think have probably given up that fight a little bit. But I thought that was interesting how they've largely faded into the background as a scapegoat. Yeah, I'm just looking over my notes. Like I said, the deregulation, how long those legs have been, and I think it does a good job of tying those things into entertainment that is being produced, which is not something I think people think of all that often. So I thought that was interesting. I wish there may be a little bit more time spent on that. He mentions it in kind of drips and drabs. What I was thinking was interesting when I was reading it, I was like, he mentions ICP. There's a pretty large section of the book on ICP, and I think he could have spent a little bit more of that time and maybe split that chapter up, because that felt the longest to me, the most dragged out. Maybe talking more about the consolidation of corporations. He talks a little bit about wrestling in the history of what was at that time the WWF and how that's changed, and the consolidation of power. He uses the WWF chapter to talk about revisionism a little bit and how that's becoming more commonplace. I think if he had talked a little bit more about corporate mergers, the idea that came to me, it's not really a criticism of the book, but just my own thought. I would have really been interested to have seen him do this instead of using 1999, but to use Woodstock 99 in that debacle and really kind of break that down from a sociological standpoint of why everything happened there. He mentions Woodstock 99 once or twice when talking about Limp Bizkit and Rage Against the Machine. I would have been an interesting book if he had wanted to do that as a topic, because I think that would have been pretty readable and also allowed him to kind of break these things down from a sociological perspective and how, the business deregulation paved the way for all these other things. So if I had any criticisms, it's a little long. I think it was a little repetitive. I think he could have cut that chapter. I think he could have trimmed the ICP chapter down. I think it goes on for a while after he makes his point. Um, and there's a whole chapter on the adult industry and how that has been, 1999. He kind of talks about how there's all these sexual scandals that are going on and how that was the beginning of there always kind of being sexual scandals and how that kind of teachers who were getting busted for that, and to this day OnlyFans and that place in the culture. I think that chapter, if I was going to cut one, probably would have been the one I was going to cut. I think I got that much out of it, to be honest with you. And if you're trying to look for things to trim, that would have been one. But um yeah, that, and then just there's one or two spots in the book in the beginning where he uses a couple stats that I felt were misleading. I think one in particular where he talks about ICP having the number 4 record to try to show like how big of a record this was. It was the number 4 record the week it debuted. It wasn't the number 4 record of the year, and I think that could have been made a little bit clearer. It doesn't really change the meaning too deeply, but if you're someone who just doesn't know anything about music, you're like, oh man, ICP sold more records than uh, the biggest band, Creed or something. They sold they were number 4 the week that they came out for that record in 99. In the year that they came out, I think they still sold over 1 million records, but they were not number 4 in the top 10 of the year. Um, who would I recommend this to? If you're interested in the 90s, and this is kind of a really strange time period because you have a relatively booming economy, you have a relatively uh, um, strong American presence. You have kind of the peace and prosperity, and this is probably one of the last few years that was really evident. He talked a little bit about the movies in 1999 probably being the last like great year in movies, and there's all kinds of great movies that came out that year. And this is kind of before the superhero boom and all that stuff. So you have this really kind of strange period, an interregnum period before the technology is kind of completely taken over, where you're starting to see it's kind of coming up through the cracks in how it is starting to weave itself into all these different industries, from video games to the adult film industry, uh, even to the wrestling, where he talks about kind of the rise of pay-per-views that were happening during the Monday Night War between WCW and WWF, which is something that you just know from knowing, but it's interesting to kind of see that. So yeah, I think this is going to be interesting to folks who maybe weren't there, and people who were there. I think it'll be a nice trip down memory lane. That is 1999, the year low culture broke. I'm sorry, the year low culture conquered America and kickstarted our bizarre times. Ross Benish. So if you're again interested in kind of a sociological examination of kind of these things that we consider low culture and how they kind of have woven their way into the mainstream and kind of taken over, I think this is a good look at that. Um, there's a glossary too. I don't know how necessary that glossary was, but again, I lived through some of this stuff, so if you don't know what new metal is, then maybe it's helpful to see that. I was just like, I don't know who is reading this book who's not going to know some of these terms, but that's there too for people if they're not aware. So until next time, I'm actually going to be reading Modern Man in Search of a Soul by Carl Gustav Jung. It'll be interesting. I think it's the first psychology or philosophical book that I've read in maybe for the channel. I guess Technically Justice by Sandel was more also philosophy, but this is not dealing with distributive justice. It's more dealing with Jung's thoughts on the individual and psychology. So until next time, psychoanalyst, psychoanalytical thoughts. Until next time, if you enjoyed this, please feel free to subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Like the video. I'll also leave a link below to Ross's Amazon page. If you want to check the book out there, you can purchase it directly from Amazon. Until next time, bye.